Thanks so much for being here and for the invitation. This is a joint work with Johannes, Rodrigo, Daniel, and Nadine. And it's been an ongoing project that has been funded to the SA Tide and WIDER. So, carbon taxation and firm behavior in emerging economies, lessons from South Africa. We all know here that unabated climate change will pose existential risk to humanity, and this is considered one of the largest, the greatest market failures the world has seen. As economists, we always say, if consumers and producers are not taking into account the byproduct of their decisions, put a price on it. And so many economists have been advocating for carbon pricing one way or another. And in fact, 65 national jurisdictions or subnational jurisdictions have implemented some initiatives, and 46 other initiatives are underway. South Africa implemented a national carbon tax in 2019, being the 13th largest emitter worldwide, the first African country to implement such a tax, potential trailblazers not only for Africa but for other developing nations, and implemented even under a lot of stress and resistance from various interest groups, including industry and labor. And the way they did it, they basically accommodated a lot of this by giving allowances. So in this paper, we are simply empirically evaluating the South Africa Carbon Tax Act of 2019 using a matched difference in difference approach based on detailed administrative data, using carbon tax data, corporate and customs data, linked employer-employee data, all through the confidential access through the lab that UNU-WIDER has contributed in creating this infrastructure for research. Just to give a preview of the findings in a nutshell, we are finding no negative effects on a variety of firm outcomes, sales, profits, inputs. Importantly, no negative effects on employment, which was a point of contention. And most of these effects are coming upon the announcement of the carbon tax bill, and it just goes over when it's implemented. The effects are largely driven by the firms that are expecting larger effective tax rates because some of them have been accommodated through the allowances, and I'll be more clear about that in a moment. So I'm going to start with some background very quickly, and then a little bit of a conceptual framework just to really take us to the data and then the empirical analysis. So the carbon policies or environmental policies in general in South Africa had been discussed for a while. Since the 2010s, they have been discussing options. And it could be command and control regulations, which mandates reductions, or carbon price mechanism, which could be cap and trade versus carbon tax, right? So, of course, in a developing country with limited state capacity, it possibly be that carbon tax is a little easier to implement, even though it could be less politically feasible, easier to implement because it could be just a handful of companies out of hundreds of thousands of companies that they can focus and they can leverage the tax authority. And that's going to be the case here in South Africa. It was pretty clear in 2015 with the draft of the carbon tax bill that they were going for the carbon taxation instead of the other options. And in fact, in 2019, they enacted on June 1st. And so we're going to be looking at the announcement and the implementation, how does the fact firm behavior. As I said, it was implemented June 1st, 2019, using the polluter pays principle. So there is an emissions factor-based greenhouse gas emissions for each plant. So again, it kills a little bit the incentives for carbon taxation because it's based on the units of production multiplied by some emissions factors, but that's how they implemented to make it easier in the process. And it started at 120 rands per ton of carbon, about 6 euros. And these would increase with inflation plus 2% every year. Not every firm is liable to the carbon tax. There are some thresholds, for example, 10 megawatt installed thermal input capacity. As I said, they also had a lot of allowances to accommodate for a variety of interest groups that could go from 60 to 95%. Just to give a sense of this, I always like to give the example of the iron and steel. So they have the same threshold, 10 megawatt of input thermal capacity. They have 60% allowance, no questions asked. This is like free of anything, at least during a transitional period. And then there are other allowances that you have to prove certain things. For example, 10% if they prove that they are exposed to trade. They have to prove that. There is performance allowances. If they are using technology that are ahead of the curve, they're cleaner already, they can claim some allowances for that, 5%. If they are participating in some carbon budget voluntarily, they can also claim 5%. And if they are buying offsets generated in South Africa, they can claim another 10%. So at the end of the day, they can claim 90% of allowances. So they would pay 10% of their tax liability. That's how it goes if you prove all this. So the overall emissions is like this. So it's a country that's the 13th largest emitter in the world. The carbon tax is covering about 80% of the emissions. That's what I said. It's easy to implement even though it's politically difficult to implement. Why? Out of 100,000 firms, or over 100,000 firms, only about 300 are actually liable here. So it's much easier to incorporate this, right? You don't have to create a new market, like for a cap and trade. But with the allowances, temporarily, it's going to be just net emissions, which is just a fraction of that until supposedly the end of this year, when the allowances are supposed to be eliminated. So most of the emissions are coming from electricity, gas, and steam air, not only in the electricity sector, but also using in manufacturing processes as well. But most of the tax are coming from the manufacturing sector and the mining sector. That's about 90% of the tax revenue, and that's why our analysis will be focused on these two sectors. Just to give a conceptual framework, what are the concerns here? Well, there are two things that we have to be concerned. One, the policy is to reduce emissions, carbon emissions, so we're going to look at that. But also, the bottom line is that firms are concerned about profits. Workers are worried about employment. So we need to look at all this factors. So if we think that these are competitive markets because these are tradables that they are producing, so we have simple profit, price versus times the quantity produced minus some cost function that depends on production, and the carbon tax if they do enact, minus whatever they're going to be paying in carbon tax if they do have the carbon tax. So if they are maximizing profit, with respect to quantity produced, we can derive what is the total effect of the carbon tax on profits. And interestingly enough, it is dependent on emissions, which is positive, the partial derivative, which is how much emissions now are relative to other inputs, and so now there's a price, and so if there's a price, they might decrease the emissions. And then, of course, how it affects cost. And this is like efficiency, or it depends on productivity, and so on and so forth. Importantly, the effects are ambiguous. Similarly, for emissions, even though putting a price on carbon will reduce emissions just partially, because this goes through the production process, there are other elements here that makes the effects also ambiguous. So it's an empirical question. We need to see what happens in reality. And that's what we do in the second part of the paper. We are going to be comparing the firms that are paying carbon tax relative to firms that are comparable in a variety of characteristics in the baseline and see what happens afterwards. So we are matching these firms at the 3-digit industry level, for example, manufacturer of basic iron and steel, and also in coarsely on profit, sales, and all the other characteristics in the baseline, which is 2015, right the year where they published the carbon tax bill, okay? We're going to be doing event studies. We're going to compare, we are leveraging variation within firms, so firms that were paying the carbon tax before and after starting paying relative to firms that are similar but are not paying the carbon tax before and after as well. And so just to give a gist of this, I'm going to be focusing here on our capital to start with. If we have estimates that are close to zero here prior to 2015, it means that the firms paying carbon tax versus the firms that are comparable but not paying carbon tax, they are going in a similar trajectory for this particular outcome, which is capital. So they were, right? Like they're going really in parallel. When the carbon tax bill is launched, the capital starts going up, and when it was implemented, start going up again. Similarly for employment, a similar pattern, different from many expected, which would be harming employment. It's not what we are seeing, at least in the formal employment or capital. For sales, a similar thing, it increases. For profits, it was a slight downward trend, which reverts afterwards, which suggests that there was some resolution of uncertainty. Now you can produce steel as much as you want. There's no cap. but you pay a carbon tax which is symbolic during this transitional period. I just forgot to say here, this evidence is suggested that capital and labor might be substitutes for emissions. If emissions become more expensive, you might be using more of capital and labor in this process. And so it's not super surreal to see these effects happening from the economic point of view. Now, is there any heterogeneity in this response? There is. And the heterogeneity here shows that the firms, the dots in red here are firms that are not claiming as much allowances because they have to prove certain things. And so by doing that, they might not be able to prove that, and they might not take the allowances that you have to prove certain things. You get the free allowances, but nothing else. They are the ones responding. The others that are claiming all the allowances, they are going really close to zero, which means they're just going almost as business as usual in this anticipatory, in this environment that are accommodating for all these concerns that they had. Similar for sales, for profits, they are the ones responding, the ones with low allowance take-up. And so, is there any effect on the environmental outcome, which is emissions? We don't have, unfortunately, emissions prior to the carbon tax. They don't allow us to get the data, for at least we asked so many times. We didn't get the data, but we got some carbon data or emissions from the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is a subsample of those firms, or looking at countrywide using a synthetic control method. The evidence shows that if anything, it's quite noisy, but if anything, it's slightly up for a little while, but it's noisy, so like there was no effect in terms of at least comparing the South African firms that are paying carbon tax versus similar firms around the world that are not paying carbon tax or not expecting the carbon tax. In terms of the aggregate emissions, we see pretty much similar trends of South Africa relative to other countries that have not enacted carbon pricing and are potentially similar to South Africa. There is a temporary increase and then there's a reduction. Just understanding, so like pretty much there, if anything, there was a little increase and then a reduction over time. What is the mechanism here? One thing we show is that, you know, it could be anticipation or it could be concerns about stranded assets. Now the legacy technology that I'm going to be using might not be as valuable. So if they are doing depreciation from the economic point of view, which is using a lot of the capital, we would have seen something on inventory. We don't see a difference in inventory for the firms which are claiming high or, I'm going to finish in a minute. Thank you. And so what we are seeing here is that the firms that are claiming low allowances are actually depreciating much more, but it's not, we don't think it's economic depreciation, that they're using the capital a lot. We think it's accounting depreciation, it's bookkeeping strategies here, because you don't see utilizations for the inventory. And this might be one strategy that's being allowed to overcome this problem, right? If they are concerned that their capital, their companies are going to be stranded, at least they can depreciate quite fast. And that might be a way to lose the cost. We don't observe anything in terms of technology upgrading. We don't see changes in R&D. We don't see lots of changes in the new imports or imports of new technologies. We see a little bit, but it's quite noisy. So most of this is coming through this concern about stranded assets, and that's what we think it might be happening. I'll conclude by saying that this is a work that we just launched as a working paper at UNU-WIDER. It shows, if anything, non-negative effects of the carbon tax, at least in this transitional period between announcement of the policy, implementation of the policy, and of course, the main outcome that we are thinking about, which is carbon emissions, it has not changed too much. The hope is that with the ramp up of the carbon tax, that this might accelerate the negative trend that we observe, at least at the aggregate level. I'll finish there. Thank you so much.